I am super happy to be here today with Buck because Buck is a Bitcoin guy. And Bitcoin is on our radar again because of Jordan Peterson's recent conversation. And so I've asked Buck to come on. And one of Jordan Peterson's questions was, can you get extremely simple and explain to me what Bitcoin is? So, but before we do that, Buck, I'd like you to start by just introducing yourself and tell us your Bitcoin background and how you got into it and what you're doing in it right now.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a developer. I'm a software engineer. I work at a Bitcoin financial services company called Unchained Capital, and Austin-based company. I'm also based in Austin myself, and the company itself, which kind of actually gives a good framework for one of the common questions that people have about Bitcoin. It's like, well, what can I use it for? Or is this for real? So I think our company is a good kind of case in point in how this is like a real thing. And what Bitcoin-based financial services mean, at least in our context, we provide Bitcoin collateralized loans. So you can deposit Bitcoin, use it as collateral to get US dollar loans rather than selling your Bitcoin if you need access to liquidity. We also provide custody services. We have these multi-signature based vaults where you can control the keys, and we would have one key as backup. And then we build up like different business services on top of that. So we're coming out with a retirement based product. We have different like business based use cases as well. So you can have different permissions on top of the vaults. And yeah, some other services like that. So that's what I'm doing now. I work on primarily the custody aspects of that. I do some of the work on our open source projects that we help maintain. But I've been in the space for a while. I think I first heard about Bitcoin maybe back in 2014. My background is actually not in tech or cryptography. It's actually in economics, which is what I studied in college. And I learned about Bitcoin when I was living in China. And I had a very practical initial use case, which was essentially when I was doing freelance web development work in China, and I'd have clients based in different parts of the world, and they would pay me maybe in my U.S. bank account or in my China bank account, and so being able to move funds between countries was actually super important to me. And so the first kind of exposure to Bitcoin, other than hearing about it in podcasts, was literally just sending $1 from myself in China to the US using Bitcoin. And it happened almost instantly. And I think I made a little bit, like a couple percentage points because of the volatility, which is kind of cool to see. And after seeing that you could send $1 basically across the planet like that so effortlessly was kind of just mind-blowing to me. So kind of got hooked, as we say now, orange pilled from that point on, and kind of started diving in first in the economic side, but then later more on the technical side and learning about how you could build applications on top of it. And I've been lucky enough to have a couple jobs in the Bitcoin industry, primarily building applications on top of Bitcoin's base layer, and trying to think about ways that it can be useful to people, and also like being able to give people the tools to handle Bitcoin or store Bitcoin in a secure and responsible way.
Okay, well, while you were talking, besides the big question of what is Bitcoin exactly and how does it work? Because when Jordan Peterson asked those guys, they went off into the stratosphere someplace, into some space that I sort of got the idea of what they're talking about when they're talking about having your own key and that it's a giant ledger that everybody has access to. So I kind of get the drift of that. But besides that big question, I have two questions. One for you. So you majored in economics, and then how on earth did you become a developer? Because that requires learning a lot of new skills, right? And then the second question would be, is Bitcoin something that just an average person can use? Because one of the things that those guys talked about was how the fiat money system that we have today is really damaging to people in lower income registers. And yet it seems like those people would be the very ones that would find it difficult to navigate something as sophisticated as Bitcoin.
Sure. Yeah. So the first question is, yeah, I mean, I got into web development and later deeper into kind of software engineering. It kind of started off just being self-taught. I like tinkering, and so I started tinkering with websites and started reading stuff and trying to solve problems that I had for myself. And then that kind of just grew from there. And I ended up doing a coding boot camp in San Francisco, which then turned into jobs, and was able to learn on the job, but also just kind of continuing to read and learn. And Bitcoin's actually been a big part of that. And this kind of leads into what you're talking about, people going into the stratosphere when they explain Bitcoin. Like, one of the fun aspects, one of the aspects that I find so exciting about Bitcoin, but can also be challenging to have conversations or to explain things, is that it encompasses so many different, different fields, right? So obviously there's the technical side about, networking, like how do different computers communicate with each other? How do they coordinate? How do they coordinate around in this type of distributed system? There's cryptography involved. There's the application layers, like how do you build things on top of it to be able to use these things? The cryptography of public-private key cryptography, and how that works into the system. And then obviously the economics, which is something that I think in the Jordan Peterson podcast episode, they were talking primarily about kind of the philosophical and also the economic implications of sound money. But and then also something that I've been personally interested in a lot is the governance aspects of Bitcoin, and how decision making is made in a distributed system, which I find a really fascinating topic, especially kind of as somebody who's like I'd say an amateur historian, I guess. Like I find American history in particular very interesting, and kind of our constitutional history and the development of that. And I've found a lot of parallels in Bitcoin. So so like learning about those things and the technical side is also kind of, I think, how I've been able to expand my career and knowledge in the space. Like Bitcoin has actually been a big help for that, because it's when you're interested in something, you feel motivated to learn more. And when something is so all-encompassing as Bitcoin, it's offered that opportunity to learn quite a bit. So and then the second question was, right, can a normal person use it? I think the answer is yes. I think there's obviously, this is something that improves with time. So, 5+ years ago, when I was first getting into it, it's definitely a lot more difficult for people that are not as technical to get started. I would say that even back then, but even more so now, there's a lot of custodial solutions. So companies that essentially abstract away all the complexity for you in the same way. So if you think about it, it's just like, most people don't actually even understand how the banking system works. Like if you were to actually understand how, if you needed to know how quantitative easing worked, to know where our money supply was coming, what M1, M2 was, what the velocity of money was, where like the interbank lending system worked, how SWIFT and ACH worked, how even the cryptography that's involved in the banks being able to communicate with each other, right? Like that's something that most people don't understand. And yet we're all using the modern banking system. We log into our bank, we check our balances, we can send money over Zelle or through ACH or PayPal or Venmo, but almost nobody understands how that technology works. One of the differences, though, if even using a custodial solution such as, let's say, Coinbase or Cash App with Bitcoin, is that first of all, you can actually know how Bitcoin works under the hood, how even like the Cash App is using Bitcoin. We have a lot more transparency into how that works than, say, how the Federal Reserve is making decisions about what their money supply is going to be, or the deals that they might be making with larger banks in terms of access to liquidity or future quantitative easing rules, or availability of bonds in the bond market. So first of all, we just have that transparency if you want it, and right, so that just adds accountability. And another thing is that if you wanted to opt out of a Bitcoin bank, let's call it, like a Coinbase or Cash App, you can. So if I wanted to learn how to manage my own keys, And I had the interest to learn a little bit more about what like having your own private key means. I can read about it, I can learn about it, I can ask people about it, and then I could say, you know what, Coinbase, I'm not interested in your services anymore, and opt out. But you can't really opt out, like, except for maybe taking all of your cash out and like burying it in your backyard or something. You can't really opt out of the current banking system. You can't do those things on your own, especially if you wanted to interact with our modern markets. But you can actually do that with Bitcoin, which is, I think, like, it's an important thing to remember is that it actually holds those institutions accountable in a way that we've never been able to do before. So we get the benefits of better user experiences that centralized companies can offer, as well as the benefits of a decentralized system that allow us to opt out.
Okay, well, I do have some questions about the whole retirement possibility, and I was going to save it for later, but maybe I'll throw it out there now. At one point in the video, the guys were talking about gold, and that nowadays you're actually prevented from saving your money in gold, because if you buy gold and hold and then you make a capital gain on it, then of course you take a big tax hit when you take it out of the gold. And so you're not actually able to save money. But I thought, well, isn't Bitcoin the same way? If you have a gain on Bitcoin, wouldn't you also have to pay capital gains on it?
Yeah, I think that part of the conversation was maybe both an oversimplification and also, yeah, I'd agree, not kind of telling the full story. I think we still have to like live under the implications of the governing system that we put into place. And certainly if we were to see something like a wealth tax, which hopefully would be avoidable on constitutional grounds, the United States at least, but something like a wealth tax would severely harm any efforts to kind of preserve your wealth in that way in something like Bitcoin. I'd also argue that both with Bitcoin and with gold, if you wanted to use it as a long-term savings vehicle, you can do things like using a Roth IRA or a normal kind of 401k IRA, which allows you to hold there are these things called like self-directed IRAs and Roth IRAs that allow you to invest in non-traditional assets to kind of do it yourself. And this is one of the products that we're going to be offering at Unchained Capital soon. And the benefits of that is, so if you do it in a Roth, you're capped at how much you can contribute, but it's after tax income. So any value that you take out after your retirement age is not taxed. So that's actually a way that in our current system, you can avoid doing that. I think the larger point that they're essentially trying to get at, well, one thing is with gold is that because the cost of storage and transportation is so high, you still have to rely on third parties. And that was something that they described about how essentially the powers that be were able to backdoor the fiat system, which because it was so impractical to use gold on your own, like even if you understood everything about it, and even if you could, you had the means maybe to store it, it's just more expensive, right? I think a story that really highlights this well for me is during World War II, when there was a high risk of the Germans actually taking over Great Britain and making landfall. There was the Churchill was determined to keep the government going, and part of that was securing their treasuries. And so there was, I think it was called Operation Goldfinch. I might have that name wrong, but it was essentially they transported all of the Bank of England's treasuries across the Atlantic to Toronto to secure their wealth. Now, that means you have the entire wealth of a single country that's on a single ship going through an ocean that is being patrolled by U-boats. And you can imagine, and they didn't, right, terrifying. And they, the Germans didn't even end up taking over the mainland of Great Britain. So imagine if that boat had sunk and, that whole operation would have been unnecessary. That's terrifying, right? And that's a big operation for even a nation state to do. So imagine doing that for an individual. And so what Bitcoin allows is for us to have that same level of security, actually, and it depends on like the level of technical expertise you're comfortable with, but you can get very, very, very high grade security at relatively low cost and relatively low complexity. Like you can say it's complex to manage your private keys on hardware devices and do all this sort of stuff, but it's also complicated to transport, however much amount of gold and to secure it properly. Mm-hmm. So you hear about something similar too with like the new like marijuana dispensaries in places like Colorado, where they need bank level security because they operate so much in cash. Because many banks don't want to touch the dispensary businesses because of the lack of clarity at the federal level. So you have a small dispensary that's like a liquor store, essentially, in terms of the service that they're providing, but they have so much cash that's coming through because they can't process credit cards or anything that they need bank level security. And that's very complicated and expensive to do. And we can now with Bitcoin do it at a much lower cost, lower complexity. And so to like bring it back to the kind of retirement thing is that I think like gold leaves that complexity in and leaves us overly reliant on these external forces. But with Bitcoin, because you have this power to opt out essentially of those systems, to be able to take control of doing this in your own hands, it makes it harder for the state to kind of sneak in these end runarounds to penalize the saving long term. So they can try and do it, but if it ends up becoming too expensive to enforce it, the state never wants to get into a position where you can call their bluff, essentially, right? If it becomes very expensive, if enforcement becomes very hard and very expensive, and it becomes obvious that people are able to, or that the cost to the state is higher to enforce than it is for an individual to kind of preserve their own wealth, that can actually that can be counterproductive for the state. And so like one of the things that I like to think about is that actually, so people will often say like, well, the government came after gold, right, under FDR, why won't they do the same thing for Bitcoin? And I like to think of it more in terms of that actually, because Bitcoin actually allows us to be more responsible for ourselves, for our own wealth, it actually will hold the government more accountable. Like most of these things, they're when they happen, they're not done under, they're not malicious. They're just misguided in their intents. And so when you have to like, if I can store all of my life savings in my head by memorizing a word phrase, because that's where my private keys are stored, how is the state going to enforce that? And so that actually, they need to be a little bit more transparent, because most people are actually happy paying taxes. They just they don't want to be paying taxes for things that they find immoral or excessive taxes, right? And so I think that actually creates a better relationship with the state because it's harder to do what they did with gold. And if it's harder to do those things, then it makes it easier for us to save, and then that benefits everybody in the long run.
Okay, so if we're looking at gold and Bitcoin, compare contrast kind of a thing, what I see happening with, in the last, gold started getting to be a big thing back in the early 80s, because actually late 70s, because of all the inflation and a lot of people playing the market in gold and all of that. So in the last 40 years, gold has been a big thing, and it's especially used. You hear it on all the conservative radio talk shows. There's always some ad for gold, buy gold from us and we'll send you a free coin, and then we'll hold all your gold for you. And it seems to me like that system is just rife with the potential for fraud, for somebody to say, oh, you buy this gold from us and we'll hold it for you. And how do I know my gold is really there?
Prove
right?
it.
Right. So is there that same potential for fraud with Bitcoin? If I have $10,000 and I want to buy Bitcoin, how much can I trust that what I'm actually getting is Bitcoin? Because there's a lot of different Bitcoin vendors out there. How do I know?
So I think this goes back to one of the earlier points I was making about kind of accountability. And so I would say that there's absolutely still the opportunity for fraud. And I think critics of Bitcoin like to point out whenever there's incidences of this, right? So like, look, somebody got defrauded, somebody sent Bitcoin, the computer was hacked, and if there wasn't Bitcoin, you wouldn't have it. And we heard this was a common refrain actually when there was the large the pipeline hack, right? It's like, well, we need to outlaw Bitcoin, because if there wasn't Bitcoin, then these hackers wouldn't be incentivized to hack and then get this $5 million in Bitcoin. mean, that's ridiculous. There have been hacks and security breaches and ransoms for, you know, time immemorial. And if it's not one, it'll be another. So really, people, it's a side comment, we just need to beef up our security and actually take these cyber threats more seriously, not outlaw the means that they're rewarding themselves. It's just showing that Bitcoin actually has value. So I'd say that as a preface to say that like Bitcoin does not eliminate fraud entirely. And if you're not discerning, you're still liable for that, to be a target for it. But what it does do is it does give you more power if you want to try and hold people accountable or to verify, then you can. So for example, actually the company that I work for now is a great example of this. So we provide a service, like I was describing earlier, our vault service, which is a 2 of 3 multi-signature vault. And what a multi-signature vault is essentially is it allows you to secure your Bitcoin in such a way that you need 2 out of 3 private keys in order to redeem the Bitcoin that's secured there. And so what we do, our primary structure for these vaults is that our customer holds 2 of the keys, we hold 1 of the keys. So that means if at any point that you want to spend, you can do it without us entirely. If you lose 1 of your keys or there's somehow compromise, or you can't get access to 1 of your keys, then you have us as a backup to be the second of the 3 signatures.
But you only have 1 key, so you can never. So
we can never spend. Exactly. All we do is we're basically just a backup. Now, one of the really cool aspects of this, though, is you're storing, it seems like you're storing on our platform, but we've also created a tool that's open source that anybody can use, that if we were to go out of business tomorrow, as long as you have your keys and the redemption information, we call it like a backup configuration file, you can spend your Bitcoin without us, right? And the other aspect of this is that you can verify your balance without us. You don't even have to be on our platform to make sure that all the Bitcoin that we say is there is there. You can go onto any block explorer, you can go onto your own Bitcoin node and verify that the Bitcoin that we say you have, you actually do have. Now, not all services provide this, right? So Coinbase, you're trusting them because we have a saying in the Bitcoin world, not your keys, not your coins. And so that's true in a service like Coinbase or Cash App. But I also would point out that I would not recommend a service that doesn't let you withdraw your Bitcoin, because the ability to withdraw your Bitcoin is what holds the service accountable to make sure that they're actually holding your Bitcoin. So for example, PayPal, Venmo, Robinhood, they let you buy cryptocurrencies, but you can't actually withdraw it. So that's an IOU, right? That's the same type of thing that you're describing with gold, which is that, oh, just give us money. We promise that we're holding the gold for you. And they're doing the same thing. And, you know, they might be honest, but the point is that this is like also kind of a governance thing. It's like the incentive alignment is actually for them to not be as responsible with it, because they can kind of pretend and hide if the underlying asset disappears. And you see this as well. Like one thing that we avoid doing at Unchained Capital that some other services provide is we don't rehypothecate. So you see this in some services where you deposit Bitcoin with them, they loan it out, and maybe they'll give a very high interest rate in reward for that. But you can't actually know where that Bitcoin is going to. You can't know that you can get your Bitcoin back out. So you're like totally, there's lots of opportunities for fraud, lots of opportunities to lose your Bitcoin. But now for the first time ever, there really is also opportunities to have services and products that don't have those risks if you choose to go down that route.
So, and your company is one of the companies that provides that opportunity?
Yes. So we don't rehypothecate, but you can store with us. You can even use your Bitcoin as collateral for a loan, and you can always know that your loan is there because you also still have one of the keys, even though you don't have the majority of the keys, but you have still partial ownership of that, and you can verify that we haven't moved your collateral. And so that that's just one of our core values, is that we want to make sure that customers always have transparency into their Bitcoin, because it is their Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. So then there's the question of the long-term value. I know that one of the reasons that Bitcoin has value is that there's supposedly a limited amount that's always only going to be that much, or is it And then there's this thing about Bitcoin mining, which makes me think that if there's mining going on, there must be an increase in the amount of Bitcoin. So how does that all work?
Sure. So there's a supply cap of the most Bitcoin that will ever have been mined. But we're still in a period of Bitcoin where there is actually inflation. It's just there is inflation at a decreasing rate over time. And so if you think of it, of the supply of Bitcoin like a logarithmic curve, right? So it has at the beginning much higher slope. And so the Bitcoin supply is increasing at a very fast rate in the early days of Bitcoin. And then it decreases over time. It's actually more of a like step ladder, but because it changes every 4 years. So what happened was the very first block ever mined, there was only 50 Bitcoins in existence, because every block mined every 10 minutes would create 50 new Bitcoin. And that happens on average every 10 minutes. And then every 4 years, that amount of new Bitcoin that's created is cut in half. So in the first 4 years, every 10 minutes, there's 50 new Bitcoin. So that's the inflation rate, 50 new Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And then the next 4 years, it was 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes for 4 years. The next 4 years, it was 12.5, then 6.25. And I think that's where we're at now. And so that keeps getting cut in half. And that's where you get that slope that basically approaches zero. And so I think we've had 80 something, maybe 86% of the total supply that has been mined already. And the last fraction of a Bitcoin will be mined within about 100 years. So we still have an inflation rate, but the total supply that will be mined is capped, and that value is capped at just under 21 million. So we just say basically 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be mined. But there's, like I said, about 18 million of those have already been mined.
Okay, so now we can ask the Jordan Peterson question. Make it very simple for me. What is Bitcoin? How does it work? What do you mean when you say mining? I mean, who's doing that? What are they getting when they are mining? I understand it requires a lot of energy to do that, whatever that is. And you mentioned block explorers and Bitcoin nodes, and I'm assuming that's all part of the definition. So let's get down in the weeds here.
Well, I mean, if we want to keep it simple, I gotta try not to go too deep into the weeds, because I've got whole books. I've got whole books on some of those questions, like programming Bitcoin. We could read through this and maybe understand a fraction of it. So I think the base way to kind of understand the innovation of Bitcoin was it created a way to do decentralized digital scarcity. So before getting into any of the technicals of how that works, I think it's important to understand that and why Bitcoin itself has value. And this is something they did talk about a little bit in the podcast, but it might have gotten lost in some of the other conversation.
They talked about the five aspects that a good money system should have, right?
Yes. And
durability, divisibility.
Scarcity. But I don't even think that's as important in terms of because you can. I mean, those are important. That is part of the reason that it has value, but it's actually kind of starting off from this base idea of how Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto invented decentralized digital scarcity, and that's something that hadn't existed before. So what does that mean? If you think about how, let's think about like pre-Bitcoin years. Let's think about like Napster, right? When there was this problem of digital rights, right? So the problem essentially that Napster kind of exposed is that before with music, you had to buy a CD, you had to buy something in a physical form, and or even before that, a record. And that was something that was very hard to replicate. You needed the right hardware in order to do that. And to transfer over that data was difficult. So even though you could copy some things, it was pretty difficult to do. Once we move into the digital realm, it's just a file. It's just data. Data is infinitely copyable. There's nothing stopping me from copying data on my computer. If you send me a document, I can just copy and paste that an infinite number of times. So as soon as something moves into the digital world, by default, you lose this aspect of scarcity. So that becomes problematic when we're talking about money in the digital world. So the way that we have money before Bitcoin again is you essentially need to trust centralized authorities to basically say, and we do this with our banks, right? So if I'm going to send you money over Venmo, Venmo is going to check if, let's say I want to send $10,000, but I don't have $10,000 in my bank. Venmo, before allowing me to send the $10,000 to you, is going to check with my banks like, hey, does this guy have $10,000 in his bank? And it'll say no. And then, and my bank just has that because they have a record in their database. So I could lie to them, but it's really just ones and zeros. So Venmo is trusting my bank to say that I don't have $10,000, and then the transfer won't go through to you. There's more complicated aspects of that, and there's elements of trust and payments that will go through, but then, you know, will fail later on, but we'll avoid that for now. So the point is that essentially you have to trust Venmo, Venmo has to trust my bank, and my bank is controlling my value. They know how much value I have, and they're storing in that database. So you need to have these trusted third parties for any digital transactions, because money is inherently scarce, right? Like I can't, even paper money doesn't work if you can copy it. So you have to put in all of these things into paper money or into checks, right? To make sure that they're not forgeable, because if they're forgeable, then you lose the value of money, right? If you've seen the movie Catch Me If You Can about Frank Abagnale, that's like a large part of that story, is that he was able to forge money. And it's like a really important thing for a financial system to make sure that you can't copy these things. It becomes even easier in the digital world. So once things are digitized like that, including money, and this is something that they talked about in the podcast as well, it becomes a lot easier for that money supply to be manipulated in a way that we wouldn't otherwise realize, because they can do it almost costlessly. But only a certain group of people have the ability to do that copying. So what Bitcoin did was like, okay, how can we have many actors around the world that we don't know if they're good actors, bad actors, if they're selfish, if they're altruistic or whatever, but we need to allow them to coordinate a value system, you know, in order to exchange value. And with gold, we used to have this to a certain extent, right? Like as long as you could weigh the gold and prove that it was as much as it said, like I didn't have to know you in order to be able to accept your gold. But you can't do that if you're buying something over Amazon, or if you're sending money to a friend or a relative that's living abroad, for example. So that's kind of what Bitcoin introduced. And if you want, I could go into the technical aspects of like how it accomplishes that. But there's basically a coordination system that allows it to make it that you have this decentralized digital scarcity. So decentralized means that peers that don't know each other all over the world can verify my value, the value that I have, not my value, the value that I own. And then digital is like, you can do this in the digital realm, and then value is value. So, and this is when they talked about in the podcast episode about a ledger. That's essentially what's going on. If you have all these nodes around the world, so let's go back to the Venmo example, but do it in a Bitcoin world. If you want to accept money from me, if I'm going to send you $10,000 in Bitcoin, there's no more Venmo anymore that's going to verify with my bank or anything. So all you can do is you can verify against this ledger. It would be like if the Federal Reserve kept a ledger of everybody's balances of US dollars in the world. And then anytime you wanted to send, rather than checking with your Venmo and your bank, you could just ask the Federal Reserve. So what if we could create such a way where you had a copy of the same ledger that I had, and every other node in the world also had a copy of the same ledger?
And you're identified on the ledger by some number that's specific to you, that is not your key.
That is your key. It's actually not tied to your identity. You can have a near infinite number of identities on the blockchain that are associated with different values.
But nobody knows your key except you. So
this is where the cryptography comes.
Your key.
Yeah. So this is where the cryptography comes in. Is there's a key pair. So you have a private key that nobody knows and a public key that everybody can know. So when somebody wants to send Bitcoin, if you want to accept Bitcoin from me, you show me your public key. And then I'm going to send the Bitcoin to the public key in such a way that it says, only the true owner of the private key that corresponds to this public key can spend this Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And in the future, if you want to spend that, you're going to say, okay, well, here's the public key that Buck sent to, and I'm going to prove that I own the private key by signing with my private key. It doesn't expose the private key information. You're just signing with it. And you know, without getting into the cryptography of it, everybody, it's very hard to forge that signature, but it's trivially easy to verify. And so what's going to happen is there's two verifications that happen when you're going to spend that Bitcoin. First, every node on the network is going to verify. It's like, oh yes, that, you know, that 0.5 Bitcoin that Karen is trying to spend, I verify that she was given that at some point. So she actually has that based off of the transaction that Buck sent her. And you can actually trace those all the way back to the first transaction ever. The second thing they're going to verify is, first they verify that that public key actually has that balance. And then they're going to verify that you will actually own the private key. And so they do that by verifying the signature. And every node in the network essentially does this. And then a miner will say, okay, I'm going to take all these valid transactions. I'm going to put them into a block. And then I'm going to send those blocks out. And once something's in a block, it can't be reversed. And so it's actually the blocks that people are verifying. So like the transaction when I sent you that 0.5 Bitcoin, that got put into a block. And so every node is saying, oh yeah, I see that block where that transaction was sent. And everybody else agreed that that transaction was sent and valid. So Karen actually has that Bitcoin.
So miners are doing some of the administrative work of making sure that the system is working. Mm-hmm. So then they get paid in Bitcoin for participating in that administrative work. And is that what it means to be mining? Yes,
exactly. The miners are essentially, you can think about it as nodes that do validation. So, you know, most active users in the space will run a node, and that doesn't do any mining. It's pretty low cost to run. The nodes essentially do validation, and they also do enforce the rules of the network via that validation. Like if the nodes reject, if you're sending Bitcoin that you don't have, the nodes will reject it, and your transaction won't get to a miner. And or if it does get to a miner, the nodes will reject the block once it goes out.
Okay, you're starting to use technical language. Yeah. Okay, so a node is a person who's
basically just a computer. Yeah, it's so if you're running
who's doing part of the verifying, who's volunteering their time to do part of the verifying via
their computer time, computer cycles. It's essentially like if you don't want to trust somebody else to verify a transaction when it's coming into you, you would run your own node, and then you would verify that somebody that's sending you a transaction actually has the Bitcoin that they say. But you can also offload that. You can have a wallet without a node, but then you're trusting somebody else to validate that transaction, and maybe they'll like you. Maybe they won't, maybe they won't. So the nodes validate those transactions, and they validate the blocks. The miners take that information, and they do what's called proof of work, which is essentially like, it can't be costless to secure these transactions, because if it was free to do, if it was free to just put it into a block, then anybody could do it, and it would be trivial to change the history of the state. So basically it takes a lot of computing power in order to do the mining, which is, it's some people in the space have a problem with this formulation, but it's the easiest way to explain it. Basically solve a math problem that proves that you did work, and then you put those transactions in, and then the miner that did the work, and the work in this case is literally just using energy in a computer to create this block and do the math problem. They are rewarded with Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin comes from two sources. One is the block reward. So that's the inflation rate that we were talking about earlier that halves every 4 years. And they also get paid in transaction fees. So right now it's not a problem because transaction volume isn't super high. But if you have a high priority transaction, you can actually pay a higher fee to have a miner prioritize your transaction to get into a block. And so those are the two ways that miners get paid. But it's not guaranteed which miner will get it. Only one miner wins every 10 minutes.
And you would want to get it into a block sooner so that a transaction could be verified more quickly in order to, like, if you're trying to close on a house or something like that.
Exactly right. Yeah.
I'm starting to get a little drift.
Yeah. No, it's a lot. And, you know, there are parallels to this in the normal financial system. So I think a lot of people don't know that in like banks between themselves actually people say, well, how can we operate a financial system if transactions settle only every 10 minutes? It's like, well, actually, I don't think many people realize that our current financial system settles transactions as much as every 2 weeks. What happens is that you're putting a certain amount of trust in the interim, right? So if I'm sending from my bank to your bank, that money, it's like it's not actually being sent until later on. That like transfer of payments, the account balances essentially doesn't really get settled until later on. So it's a similar thing that happens, but it's challenging because you have to do it in a decentralized way. So any of these changes that happen, you have to publish out and have this coordination. So that was the first step, right? The decentralized digital value. You have to coordinate between all of these disparate actors in terms of how to come to a conclusion every 10 minutes. It's essentially what's happening is that you have computers all over the world that are coming to a conclusion, to an agreement about the newest state of the ledger every 10 minutes, which is what our banks do now.
Well, so what you said right now, there aren't that many transactions, but what would happen if this scaled up so that the whole world's financial system was on this system? Would it still function? I mean, is it got that kind of capability?
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question, and that's one that to answer properly we would have to get even more technical. But basically, the way to think about it is you would have Bitcoin's layer 1 on the blockchain would be the settlement layer, and then you'll have layers higher up, layer 2, layer 3. This is how we typically talk about it in the Bitcoin world, where you don't have absolute finality, but you have a degree of certainty that you have access to the value that you think you have without it actually being lined on a block. So there's 2 ways that this can happen. Right now, we're already doing this in exchanges, right? So like in Coinbase. So there's people that are high frequency traders of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And they're buying and selling Bitcoin like, you know, thousands of times in a day based off of whatever like the volatility happens to be. Those transactions are not necessarily settling on the blockchain. You're trusting that central third party to give you credit for what they say you have. Now, obviously, that's not ideal, and we don't want that for all transactions because then we're almost duplicating the current system. But I say almost duplicating because at the base layer, you still need to be able to withdraw your Bitcoin. And if you can't, that exchange is going to go out of business. That's not true today, right? Because now you're just settling essentially with the Fed. And if the Fed, you know, they can do whatever they want at the base layer, but an exchange can't do whatever they want at the base layer in Bitcoin. So that's one version of layer 2. We already have thousands of more transactions that are happening every day, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions maybe, then are actually being recorded in their final state on the blockchain. But it's that final state that's the most important. But then we have more decentralized layer 2s. One of them that is probably the most well-known today is called Lightning, or the Lightning Network. And the Lightning Network is a way to do it's a way to do transactions in a trustless manner without settling on the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, it's a little complicated about how this works, but essentially what it does, if we think about it in a very simple network that only has the 2 of us on it, right? So Karen has her wallet, Buck has his wallet, and we want to establish a channel between each other so that, let's say, maybe like, I don't know, maybe we're trading, maybe there's a lot of frequent activity, payment activity that's happening between us. And we don't want to have to settle on the blockchain every time that there's a transaction. So let's say we each put 1 Bitcoin into a channel. And what that means is essentially we spend into a Bitcoin transaction, then that does get put onto the blockchain. But the spending conditions about how to spend those Bitcoin is a little bit more complicated. And we have this other transaction that's like, how do we spend those outputs? And that can rebalance. So let's say, so we each have one Bitcoin in this each put one Bitcoin in this transaction, and the initial state is we each get one Bitcoin back. Okay, that's the initial state. Now let's say that I'm going to send you 0.1 Bitcoin. Rather than sending you just 1.1 Bitcoin on the blockchain, we're going to change the spending transaction that we haven't put on the blockchain and say, oh, actually, when we spend this, Karen's going to get 1.1 Bitcoin and Buck is only going to get 0.9. So I've effectively paid you 0.1 Bitcoin. You can verify this. We have this transaction that's cryptographically secure that at any time you could put onto the blockchain to redeem the 1.1 Bitcoin, but we haven't had to put that on the blockchain.
So it's basically just a kind of a ledger that keeps track of the internal trading that's coming out of this pot of money that you have put in together, right?
Yeah, and there's almost no limit. You can do millions of transactions a second doing that, and then there's that concept has been built out into a network such that let's say I don't have a channel directly with you, but I have a channel directly with Alice. Alice has a channel directly with Bob. Bob has a channel directly with you. I can actually send to you through Alice and Bob through the same mechanism.
Okay, so then it does come down to tax situations. So if the inflation that's happening on Bitcoin, are people being taxed on that at capital gains, or is it a straight?
Not on the inflation. So inflation's different. Like inflation actually is even, it makes like every time new Bitcoin is added to the ecosystem, the relative value of my Bitcoin holdings actually goes down. So right, because I now have But
Bitcoin is going up somehow. How's it going up then?
Because you have a decreasing rate of supply with an increasing rate of demand. More and more people are interested in holding Bitcoin, while the number of new Bitcoin that's created every 10 minutes is decreasing.
Okay, so with the increasing demand, the value of the Bitcoin is going up. With that increase in value, is that being taxed, or is that only taxed when you spend the Bitcoin or when you turn it into dollars, or how does that work?
Yeah, currently the IRS considers Bitcoin essentially as a commodity. So it's taxed in the same way as any sort of commodity asset. So as you correctly pointed out, that they kind of glossed over in the Jordan Peterson conversation, if you sell Bitcoin that you've been holding and the prices and the value has gone up in dollar terms, in the same way as would happen with gold, you would get taxed on the earnings of that sale.
But if you just continue to hold the Bitcoin, you have Bitcoin, but you're spending it, does that throw it into the tax frame?
Yeah, that's a bit more of a gray area. Technically, yes. That's every sale is considered a taxable event. There has been proposed legislation to consider Bitcoin spends under a certain amount, I think $600, as not a sale, but just like using it as a monetary asset. There are other countries that treat it explicitly so. I believe Japan, Australia have laws like that on the books, treating it as a currency in normal currency transaction under like $500. The recent legislation that's passed, it is now legal tender in El Salvador as of this month, I believe. And so there's like, you can spend it like you would any other currency. And there's no taxes or capital gains on it. So it's a jurisdictional question, but yeah, currently in the US, any spend of Bitcoin is considered a taxable event.
So you mentioned it's being used in a lot of different countries now. And Jordan Peterson said that he doesn't want to ever talk in a conspiratorial frame, and I agree. So I'm not talking in a conspiratorial frame here, but I am trying to understand a difference between money and Bitcoin in terms of if either one of them ever became a world system, what would the relative dangers be of having them be a world system in terms of people being able to access their money and not, you get what I'm trying to say? I mean, obviously the banking system as it is now, if that ever became a complete world system, I mean, it is sort of now.
Yeah,
but
it is there, right?
Right. But I mean, if there were one government that was governing the world and had control over this monetary system, then only those people who were approved by the government. I mean, we see this with the social credit thing in China right now, right?
Yeah, I mean,
governmental approval, you can no longer spend. So
well, and we see that, you know, if the U.S. wants to sanction countries, they basically cut off access to the U.S. banking system and the U.S. monetary system. So I think we're already in that world. I don't think we'll ever get to a place, you know, barring some like external alien threat that unifies the whole planet. I don't think we'll get to a point where we have like one world government, because human beings, if there's one thing that we do consistently, it's disagree with each other.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'd ever get to that point, but we're functionally there, right? Like since Bretton Woods, the U.S. central bank has essentially been custodian of the monetary financial system. Part of that is, I totally agree with Jordan Peterson's framing of it, which is that there's an inherent trust. I think people think about it too much in conspiratorial terms, but I think if the U.S. was China, the U.S. dollar would not be the global reserve asset. It's just the U.S., for all of our faults, and you know they become more and more apparent with every passing day, it seems. We are still the, I think this might be anachronistic, but the Churchill saying, right, like we are still the least bad option of all the other bad options, right? So he said that about democracy, and then about Americans doing the right thing only after trying everything else. And I think that's true, right? I mean, the U.S. is like, we're super untrustworthy, and our financial system is also untrustworthy, but we're still more trustworthy than any other viable option. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I think we're there already. We have that world financial system, and it can be used as a weapon. And actually, it's better that we use that as a weapon than, you know, traditional military, because that can be so much more harmful and costly in a lot of ways. So, but yeah, so we have that. We kind of see the consequences in inequality. We see the consequences in the U.S. kind of having unilateral ability to govern other areas of the world, for better or for worse. Maybe that's a good thing. Like without any value, that's what we have as a consequence of our current system. IMF to a lesser degree, but they certainly don't have as much clout as the U.S. And the U.S. is like the biggest stakeholder in the IMF too. But then, yeah, okay. So what are the dangers if Bitcoin becomes a global fight? Like first of all, I'd say like Bitcoin already is like a global financial system. Like it does encompass everybody. I think there's people in probably almost every country in the world that certainly have access to it and may even hold it to a certain degree. We've seen the impact of having Bitcoin as just something that exists has been hugely and profoundly impactful on people that I know and have spoken with in areas like Venezuela, in Argentina, that also has been having their own financial insecurity. Alex Gladstein he's a Bitcoiner that worked for the Human Rights Foundation, and he talks a lot about how Bitcoin is being used in a lot of places that by people that are underrepresented, underprivileged, and underbanked. So even like places like Palestine, Cuba now is becoming a tool that anybody can use as a way to kind of opt out of the control and the strictures imposed by either their government or the U.S. government. I mean, one reason El Salvador adopted it as legal tender is they had been using their primary currency was basically the U.S. dollar. And, you know, that has been very good for them in many ways, but it also, they recognize that there's a vulnerability that they no longer want to expose themselves to. So that's the good. I'd say we're already there. It's just a matter of like, you know, how deeply ingrained it becomes in the system. And as to future risks.
Well, let me rephrase the question a little bit.
Sure.
Sometimes we say, you know, Jordan Peterson's always talking about how what's really wrong with these nihilistic people is when they say, well, if I ruled the world,
Yeah.
right? So if I ruled the world and I decided I was going to just impose Bitcoin on everybody as the new fiat currency, okay?
Well, it wouldn't be a fiat
Is that a
currency
good thing or a bad thing for the world? Is that a good thing or a bad thing for individuals?
It's definitely a good thing for individuals. I would say it's probably a good thing for the world. I mean, one problem would be just doing it like one day we're on our current system, the next day we're on big. That would be disruptive because there's a lot of change. You know, I think one thing that can be viewed as a good thing and a bad thing is it, and this is, I think, the types of things like on the philosophical level that they're probably trying to get at more in that Jordan Peterson episode, which is that it brings us back to a place where you become more responsible for yourself again, right? So like, yeah, it doesn't eliminate fraud, and the US dollar also doesn't eliminate fraud. But one of the challenges with Bitcoin is that a transaction is irreversible. You have to trust yourself. So if you send to a scammer, if you send some Bitcoin, that's on you. There's no bank that can reverse that. Now we might be able to create layers on top of it. We might be able to have credit cards, and a company takes on that risk. But you know, if you're using Bitcoin directly, you have those risks. Now, if we also are on a Bitcoin standard, similar to, you know, when you had a gold standard, governments are a little bit more constrained in the tool sets that they have to fight certain battles, whether that's like financial crises or wars. Now, that's a good aspect of that. It means that they are held accountable, that, you know, they actually have to tax their citizens directly rather than indirectly through inflation. But, you know, if they are unable to make the argument effectively, but it's a good thing for them to be able to somehow tax more or take out debt, you know, you can have some instability as a result of that. So, but I think all of that is just to say it's not like, you know, Bitcoin itself and even the impacts of it, if we're on a full Bitcoin system, is valueless. It's neither good nor bad, but it actually creates an environment where we have a greater sense of our own. You have more responsibility over yourself and accountability, and that has consequences. It's a lot easier to blame somebody else, and it's a lot easier to have somebody else save you. But it can have negative consequences on, or for lack of a better word, our soul, right? What it does, it undermines our faith in ourselves, our ability to take care of ourselves effectively, to take care of those around us. If we create these mental habits of assuming that if I make a mistake, that it's someone else's responsibility to fix it. So the mistakes will happen. They might happen more, certainly at the beginning, and that's a bad thing in a way. But I think ultimately a good thing if we kind of rebalance that, rather than right now we have this fiat system where if something bad happens in one place, you can kind of redirect it somewhere else through where you pump money. Right? We kind of saw this during this most recent crisis with coronavirus. It's just sort of like, oh, well, all this bad stuff is happening because we've shut down the government. Well, let's just give some money to the people that we think are going to be the loudest about being upset. And you just give money to them, but that doesn't really solve the underlying problem. It doesn't solve the problem of the businesses closing. It doesn't solve the supply chain problems. It allows people, canceling rent as well. It's these types of things that, it feels good. You're helping somebody. It's easy to make that argument, but it actually distracts from the actual problems that are happening. And that's problematic. And unfortunately, we won't see the cost of that until much later.
Well, yeah, and it's a redistribution that's completely skewed because they really have no idea of knowing whether the money got to the right people.
And we know that a lot of it didn't.
Stories about that,
yeah.
Right? And I know people who got the money who didn't need it.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people who didn't get the money who did need it. And the same with the loans. I know people who desperately needed that loan and didn't get it. And then I know other companies that had absolutely no need of those loans, but they had better lawyers. And so they got the loans faster. So yeah, I mean, that kind of thing is, you talked a little bit about the issue with responsibility, which I'm really glad that you cleared that up, because when they said that Bitcoin gives you more responsibility, they didn't really explain what that meant. But the way you explain it now, I see clearly. But we have a world in which, for I was going to say for better or worse, but really for worse, where most of us have relied on this victimization thing, or letting the credit card solve my problem if I get shafted by somebody. If there were more of a move towards Bitcoin, are people ready for that level of responsibility? I guess that's the thing that I really wonder, because
no, that's the question. And that's kind of what I was getting at, is like, I think that the biggest negatives would just be the kind of like that again, it depends on how quickly we get there, but that type of impact could be very disruptive. And my hope is that the US is still stable enough, and that Bitcoin introduces enough of a kind of competing lever that we can ease into it. And you definitely see this amongst newer Bitcoiners, that actually, and you see this as well in kind of the movement around Jordan Peterson, is that there's a hunger for a responsibility movement. Like, people do want to feel like they are able to take care of themselves, that they are able to take care of their loved ones, and that when that tool is given and it's put out there and and people are given exposure to that they actually grab onto it willingly. And if you don't want it to happen all at once, but putting these things out there does start to introduce, it even just introduces those ideas. And then once people get a feeling for what that means to be like in control of your own wealth and like sovereign over your own savings, it's like, it's a both empowering and also terrifying thing, right? Just like, oh my God, like I am responsible for my savings now. Like if I lose my private key, if I'm not securing it well, then that's on me. That's my fault. I can't blame anybody else. And that's terrifying. But it's also like, all right, now I need to learn a little bit about this. Now I have something at stake in this system. So I want to be a player in this system. I know that I will never allow more Bitcoin to be created. So I will run my own node and make sure that the only software I'm running is one that doesn't allow for any excess inflation. And you do all these things, and it's kind of like this process that's introduced, and it can happen. It can happen over a longer period of time. But yes, I mean, I think you're right. Like if it happens all at once, I think there's a lot of Bitcoiners often that will almost look with glee upon the like impending collapse of modern society, because it will bring about, and you see that it's like anarcho-capitalists and libertarians, you see this as well. It's like, well, let the parties destroy themselves because it'll be great. And well, there's going to be this like, the Dark Ages happened, how many centuries in Europe of the Dark Ages after the collapse of the Roman Empire, when they started basing their currency. It wasn't good. And maybe it wouldn't last as long because we have better tools now. But it can be a hard adjustment. And so hopefully, my belief is that actually Bitcoin is the thing that gives us the tools to actually do it gradually, to do it slowly, as we introduce these things.
Well, the thing that sounds very similar to me is like the way things were when I was a kid, when there was no plastic. We didn't have credit cards. You couldn't charge anything that you wanted, you had to pay cash for it. So you had to be responsible, because you had to make sure that the thing that you're buying is something you really need, and that you value that more highly than money that you just let go of. And we've lost that tether completely now in today's world.
I think about buying a home, right? Like if it wasn't subsidized by inflation and artificially low interest rates, and the price of housing would go down because people wouldn't be able to afford it, and you would also have a higher the down payment that you have to make, right? It would go from like what 5% now that people can get away with to 20 to 50%. That would be like required. So you'd have a lower price, you'd have these higher down payments, which also starts to mean it's like, oh, okay, if I want a house, if I want to be able to buy a home in 10, 20 years, I have to start saving now, right? And that's another type of thing that I think they were getting at in that conversation with Jordan Peterson. It's right now we think in terms of immediate gratification. But it's not an irrational choice, right? If everything is subsidized, it actually costs you more not to spend now. If you save now, but your saving is going to be debased in 10 to 20 years' time, you want to spend now. Take those low interest rates. That's actually the rational choice. but it's unhealthy for society as a whole. So it actually distorts the overall rational choices that we would make in a free market. Whereas if you take that system out, it's basically, you know, buying votes and happiness now, like the Soma of A Brave New World, for the costs that we will see further on down the road, which might be like another financial crisis. So, well, you know, if you have to save.
Yeah, that brings up a good point, because I did want to talk about the 2008 housing crisis. Mm-hmm. Jordan Peterson put forth his idea of what caused it. Those guys put forward their idea of what caused it. But I also think there's another element that they didn't bring up, and I want to run this by you and see what you think, because I know you have a background in economics, and I'm only speaking from my own personal experience of having lived through the big inflation of the 70s, and we owned a little farm that we bought at 13% interest. And we put some money into it, and we should have been able to sell it for twice of what we paid for it. But by the time we were ready to sell, the interest rate was 18%. And nobody wanted to pay even how much. They didn't even want to give us back what we had originally paid for the place because of the increase in interest. So, but one of the things that was true back then was that when you had a loan, it was from your local bank. You went in every month to your local bank and you gave them a check for your mortgage. So you had a relationship with the local banker. And that was something that got severed over time, to where I remember back maybe in the early 90s, you got a mortgage with a mortgage broker, and then the mortgage gets sent off to somebody else, and pretty soon you get a letter in the mail, oh, your mortgage is no longer with Citibank, now it's with Bank of America. And pretty soon you're 4 degrees difference from whoever owns your mortgage. So that kind of thing was happening. The other thing that was happening is that in the run up to 2008, there were more and more of these 0% interest loans being given out, or sliding mortgages. And part of that was that the brokers, I don't know if this is still true, but the mortgage brokers at that time were incentivized to get these loans going, because their commission was on the original transaction, not over time. So if the mortgage is successfully paid on every month, the broker gets a little bit of money. No, he gets it all at once in a lump sum, whether that mortgage is a successful transaction or not down the road. So it seems to me that those things had something to do with the whole thing collapsing when it did, but nobody ever talks about any of those things. So I'm just wondering if my intuitions are wrong.
Sure. I mean, I would argue that I think people do talk about it, but they're talking about it in in some ways the root causes, right? So like the question is like, why were there 0% interest mortgages, right? Why are they rewarded? It's funny that that story that you're describing about how they're rewarded on their commission on the purchase now. That's very similar to what the other examples we're talking about now, where you're actually incentivized to spend money now and buy assets now rather than saving for the future, right? It's the same thing, right? And this is an aspect of when you can print money to buy your way out of problems. It skews the incentives systems, right? So if the banks know that if something goes wrong in the unlikely black swan events, they'll get bailed out because that money can be just created out of thin air. You want to incentivize as much volume, as much transaction volume, as much empty wealth essentially now, and push forward the potential costs and risks further into the future. It's the same exact phenomenon. It's also interesting, you talk about how it was harder to sell your home when the interest rate went up. And, it's funny because the stories that you heard starting around the 90s was essentially like, real estate's the best investment because the value only goes up. It's like, why is that true? That shouldn't necessarily be true, especially if we have plenty more space, the cost of building stuff goes down. Like there's no reason why it has to go up. And, it's actually a good thing. And it turns out like, no, that wasn't always true. Like, that the housing prices could fluctuate. And because if you artificially depress these interest rates to go down, it actually does incentivize you to buy as much real estate now. And then you have more and more people going into that spending now causes the value to go up. They can artificially decrease the rate through the bundling of the riskier mortgages. And then you can sell into the future. If it's not guaranteed that you're going to sell into the future, you're going to be much more circumspect about making any house purchase now, right? You're going to make like, oh no, I really want this. I want this for my family, even if the house value doesn't go up, or I want this, or you're going to do your due diligence. You know, like I believe that the value of this area is going to go up in 20 years. Like you really have to care and think about it because you're actually taking a risk. But we priced risk out. We hid risk and moved it elsewhere. And I think, you know, something else that this is less to do with the money printing, but more like a regulatory and a moral hazard thing that this is something that I also don't think is talked about enough in the context of this, that banks, you know, people say, oh, well, the banks, they did illegal things and people lost their homes and it wasn't fair and they're exploiting, you know, people that didn't have good financial education and that's not fair. They didn't break any laws in most cases. In many cases, they were responding to incentives. And what were the incentives? Well, we had 60 to 70% of the housing market at that point in time was run by Fannie and Freddie Mac, which were as it turned out, it became explicit, but at the time was implicitly backed by the faith of the government, which means that they could give out home loans at a much lower rate, right? The interest rate reflects the risk, but there's no risk if you're backed by the government. And if you're backed by the government's ability to print money in order to buy your way out of problems. A normal private bank, though, they have to, if they're going to give a loan out to a customer, they really have to understand the risk and they're going to price that in with interest rates. Now, how do you compete then with somebody that basically doesn't have to price risk properly? You find other ways around it, right? So what you would do, so one way is you would have like the bundling of banks together, right? So a small bank can't compete because they have to price risk properly. A larger bank, because they are operating at such higher scales, can actually move the risk around and actually protect themselves by having so much more risk. But even they can't compete with the government. So what do? They come up with new financial mechanisms to hide the risk by bundling them together and selling them off as assets. This is all just, again, responding to incentives by skewing the market and hiding the cost of risk.
Didn't they also buy insurance through AIG to protect themselves on risky loans?
Right, exactly. I mean, that's another.
The government bailed out AIG because, yeah, what a mess. What a mess.
And like, you know, imagine if the government had to actually tax its citizens in order to pay for some of these things. Probably wouldn't happen. Certainly at not such a large scale. It would happen in smaller ways and then we would adjust. The market would respond, risks would be calculated differently and we'd be able to learn. But what, like, the only lessons we learn now is like, oh, well, I'll be bailed out. Like we are subsidizing risk today at the expense of much larger risks down the future.
Well, so as you look at the way things are now, I mean, just take a clear, clean look at the way things are with all of our fears and our weaknesses and our victimization and our putting off today what, you know, for tomorrow and all of that kind of thing. Are you hopeful about the future?
Well, we've got Bitcoin now, so that's, you know, one thing to be hopeful about. Yeah, I mean, you know, I like I was saying earlier, I think people do crave the types of messages that you know, Jordan Peterson is sharing, these ideas of responsibility, of self-sovereignty, of taking care of yourself. It's just we have bad habits that we need to break. My hope is that we can break them slowly rather than it coming all at once, because if it comes all at once, you know, we're all at the whims of the larger society. And when society goes crazy, it doesn't matter if you have guns, if you have Bitcoin, you know, if you have gold, it catches up with you. Like everybody kind of gets sucked into that. So hopefully we can avoid that fate. But I think there's a lot of positive threads. I think, you know, ultimately, I think the United States is still a force for good in the world. I think we have a positive message. I think we have good lessons that we have at the foundation of our society, even if we lose it at some of the higher levels of our society. But I think there's, and then, you know, things like Bitcoin, and if you know, to the point of reasons to be hopeful of even the United States. You know, the U.S. is probably the most friendly large jurisdiction in the world to Bitcoin, and that's really hard to accomplish, and that comes through states. You know, we have very strong states' rights here, so places like Texas and Wyoming and Kentucky that are passing pro-Bitcoin laws at their local levels, encouraging Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin businesses to come to their jurisdictions. We have members of the federal government that are open advocates and owners of Bitcoin, and for the types of messages we've been talking about here in relation to Bitcoin. So that's a really positive thing, and so hopefully we can continue to introduce those ideas, those tools to a broader and broader audience. I mean, you know, to think that however many, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people that listen to Jordan Peterson talking to 4 Bitcoiners, if you would have said that, you know, Bitcoin would have had an audience like that even a few years ago, it would have been hard to believe. But there is that audience. Someone like Jordan does have that audience, and it's a message that people obviously are interested in. So that's reason to be hopeful.
So one final question. Where you are now, are there other people that you know that have been interested in Jordan Peterson's work, or are you kind of a sole provider?
No, definitely. I mean, it's not as common of a topic of conversation, I'd say, as like just the Bitcoin stuff. But no, it definitely comes up. I definitely see it in my Bitcoin Twitter feed, where people will share things, certain things of Jordan Peterson as well. So he's definitely, I think there's a lot of awareness, I'd say, in the Bitcoin space of Jordan Peterson for sure.
But we haven't yet seen a phenomenon of men's clubs getting together to talk about responsibility because of what Jordan Peterson is talking about.
Maybe not, but like, you know, that manifests in different ways. You know, we talk about, like, we have a lot of the same overlapping messages we have a monthly Bitcoin meetup here in Austin, and it's the largest regular gathering of Bitcoiners in the world. We have regularly anywhere from 100 to 200 people that fly from all over the country and all over the world just to talk about. It's mainly a technical conversation, but we have a lot of non-technical people that come. A lot of the conversation, we go out for barbecue after, and a lot of the conversations there are around all sorts of things, including some of these messages as well. So I don't think it has to be as explicitly manifest in that form to get the same benefits and to feel confident that those conversations are happening.
That's a great place to stop. Thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your knowledge, Buck.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm going to look up Unchained Capital and see if I can read more or figure out what it is you guys are doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I recommend reading Parker Lewis's blog on our website. Actually, it talks a lot about these things, a lot about the financial implications of Bitcoin and our current world. And he talks about, he goes through a lot of the kind of like most common straw men as well. And his blog is called Gradually Then Suddenly. So if you search for Parker Lewis, Unchained Capital, Gradually Then Suddenly, it will come up, and it's definitely an enlightening read.
Gradually and suddenly?
Gradually Then Suddenly.
Gradually Then Suddenly. Oh, okay. He had to make sure he made the longest possible thing. Is that a .com or is that a blogspot?
So it's a blog that's hosted on, it's like a part of our company blog, but he has a series that he calls Gradually Then Suddenly.
And your company website is just unchainedcapital.com?
If you go to unchained.com, yeah.
Oh, Unchained. Wow, you guys got the good URL. Okay. Thanks again, and I trust that you and your lovely bride are enjoying Austin. And
absolutely, it's a little hot this time of year, but yeah, we're very happy to have landed in the free state of Texas.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.